Sociology grew out of this modern way of thinking. Societies came to be seen as real things, to be studied and improved.
The basic ways in which Enlightenment ideas were transmitted to sociology was very much in the form of having a science of society, a science which would enable you not only to explain, but also to predict.
Sociologists aren't so ambitious today. They don't see sociology as a predictive science, but most of them still share the Enlightenment idea of providing some special knowledge of how societies work and shape our lives.
And basically, sociologists want to provide explanations and theories that everybody believes in. They're not in the business of providing ideas that people can take or leave as the mood chooses.
When sociologists refer to modernity and take their ideas from the Enlightenment, I suppose there are three principal ideas that they're drawing upon. The idea that society is ordered, the idea that we can understand that order through some kind of rational process, and finally the idea of progress, that society is developing in a beneficent way towards some future state which is preferable to the present one.
Postmodernists reject all three and argue that a totally new form of sociology is needed. But why? Their starting point is that we're now in another period of fundamental social change and that modernity is ending. No one is quite sure what this new society is like, or even what to call it, only that it's different from modernity, hence the term postmodernity. But what do sociologists mean by postmodernity?
Now, what it normally means, postmodernity, is that we're living in a society today, the end of the 20th century, when some of the assumptions and some of the institutions associated with modern society from about the end of the 18th century through to the early part of the 20th century are becoming superseded or becoming obsolete.
So why do postmodernists argue we're now living in a different type of society? What's happened over the last 30 or 40 years to make them think this? Maybe we need to start by going back and having another look at the swinging 60s. Fashion shocked in the 60s. It's hard to imagine now the fascination and outrage caused by these haircuts and these skirts. These fashions were seen to symbolise a new freedom and decadence in the young, which authorities struggle to control. You'd be sent home from school if your hair was too long or your skirt too short.
School, we had to wear a skirt that was, I don't know, two inches maybe above the knee, and to check it you had to kneel down and the teachers would measure that your skirt came X inches above the knees.
I remember walking down the King's Road with a girlfriend wearing a very short skirt, followed by an American tourist with a Kodak brownie, shooting us down the King's Road and up around several other streets, saying, "My God, I will never believe this at home."
While the 60s is seen as a time of great rebellion and innovation in fashion, actually there were quite strict rules, which most people followed most of the time.
There were rules for fashion. The rules were that people wore the same things pretty well. You know, we all followed the herd, if you like. I tried to lead a bit, but there were also rules in that you didn't wear trousers in what were considered unsuitable places, and you tried to wear a slightly longer skirt in places where people might not think it's suitable in more formal situations.
So one weekend being down at the parents with my girlfriend, she was wearing an extremely short skirt, as she did and as people did in those days. And on Sunday afternoon, my mother took me aside and said, "I wonder if you could ask Jane just to wear a slightly longer skirt next time. I don't mind myself, but Dad is objecting."
But what about fashion today?
There are no rules on what people wear these days for young people. I mean, I'd go, wherever I wanted in anything I wanted. In fact, Sure enough, there's people who follow designer fashions. But myself, I'd pick up something in the second-hand shop and I'm fine if I like the thing, if it makes me feel good, then I'll wear it.
Yeah, I feel pretty much the same about that. I think there aren't as many rules as there used to be in fashion. There perhaps aren't any at all. It's all moving on. And if you feel comfortable in something and you think it expresses something about your character, then why not wear it? It's like people are making their own pieces of art out of the things they wear and the fashions they follow, and they are that piece of art.
Today, fashion is much more a statement of personal identity and preference. But what's true of fashion can also be found in the key areas of life studied by sociologists. Take the family and marriage, for example. Even in the 60s, people were expected to be married before living together.
People expected to get married in the 60s. It was the normal thing. Living over the brush or in the sin was considered quite shocking. Having said that, I did live together with my now ex-husband before we were married, and his parents didn't speak to us for several months because we were living together.
No, it wasn't. I knew a lot of people that got married at 18. And I mean...
But you were expected. I mean, when you left school, you got an apprenticeship or whatever. Very few people went to university in the
Exactly.
60s.
Exactly.
And, as you say, you got a job, had to buy a house, and you expected to get married. All within 7 years of being in school. Yeah.
Exactly.
You did it in a fairly set pattern, didn't you? You
Yes.
got engaged and you saved up your bits and pieces.
Oh, yes.
And,
Yes.
and it was all very organised, and you wouldn't have got married till you had all these things that
And
you
you
needed.
yeah, good.
And if you didn't get married, it wasn't because you'd chosen not to, it was because, as they said then, you'd been left on the shelf. But what do young people think today?
Do I expect to get married? I don't really think about it. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't happen, then it doesn't happen. I'm not looking for a husband. It's not something that's important to me. But I wouldn't say that I definitely won't get married because I don't know yet. I'm too young to make that kind of decision.
I think I probably will end up getting married. I don't know who to or when, but it's just... the option's always there and I'll probably end up taking it up. It's not an issue anymore, but I think I can quite see it as something that you would do to make someone certain that they felt really strongly about it.
It's a good label to give to a
Yes.
relationship.
Yes.
I mean, it's not a religious thing, but it's a good label to give.
A boy in my class at school, he got a girl pregnant when he was 17 and had to get married. I still think about it today because it was such, this chap got this girl pregnant and a frisson ran down. I used to be to fall pregnant, I think the expression was, wasn't it? Was you just got married immediately.
Well, you definitely had to marry the father.
Mm.
There was no choice.
But it was almost a silly thing that people suddenly said, well, they must have been having sex.
If you got pregnant in the 60s, by and large, you had to get married. Not many children were born out of wedlock, and those who were had a stigma attached to them. A girl of my age was born out of wedlock, and everybody at school knew it. And it was very hard for her, I think.
I mean, friends of my parents, well, a girl got pregnant when she was 16, and she couldn't obviously marry the partner for whatever reasons, and she ran away and went into one of those terrible homes where they had the babies. Awful.
If I got a girl pregnant, it's really up to her choice. We probably wouldn't get married, it's not a strong enough single reason to get married. But it's very much the woman's choice.
If I got pregnant, it's hard to say what I'd do because that hasn't happened yet. I wouldn't feel obliged to get married. I might do if I felt like that. I might even give the baby up for adoption. I might have an abortion. All the options are there. It would depend on what I felt at the time, what way my life was going at the time, and what situation I was in.
It's not that people are abandoning all the old roles. People still get married and hope it will last forever. But the point is, these days, you don't have to. The traditional wedding is just one of the options. So is whether or not to have children, and whose name they'll take if you do. And if it doesn't work for you, well, you can always move on. In the 1990s, there was one divorce for every 2 marriages. Some sociologists say it doesn't make much sense to talk about the family and marriage as a lifelong commitment anymore. They talk instead about households and serial monogamy. That is, a person will typically have several long-term relationships rather than one.
So it seems the Eagles got it right in New Kid in Town when they wrote, "I'll love you forever," till somebody new comes along.
But the much greater choice people now feel in marriage and personal relationships is reflected in other areas of their lives. And it's this choice that's the essence of what's been called the postmodern condition.
I think the postmodern world can very reasonably be described as one of incessant choosing. In the past there were norms and rules which strictly govern practically every aspect of our lives. In the postmodern world, however, if I choose to give an interview lying on a bed, well, so be it, that's my choice. Similarly with the clothes we wear. Once the clothes we wore were very strictly governed by norms and rules which said what was appropriate on what occasions. If in the postmodern world I choose to wear a jacket in bed, that's perfectly all right. We are faced with a huge number of choices all the time in everything we do. We don't have any guiding principles anymore on which to make these choices. So you could take the example of food. In the past, what we had for our meals would have been given very largely by the norms of the society in which we live. Nowadays, anything goes. One can have a traditional English breakfast followed by an Italian lunch and then go to the Indian restaurant for a curry in the evening. One could even mix all these styles on the same plate, and there are no rules which tell us that this is a wrong thing to do anymore.
That there is no advice given to people on how to think and how to feel and how to react in various situations. Now this means, of course, that individual people can choose to live their lives however they wish, and that is a situation of almost total choice.
Individualism now reigns supreme. Postmodernists argue that for the first time, masses of people now feel they can change their lives, be what they want to be. We've become our own works of art, to be transformed and improved in mind and body, especially in body. But this choice and individualism brings its own problems.
There's no general agreement about what is understood by the postmodern condition, but most postmodern writers would contain within that discussion something about uncertainty.
But it's very different from previous generations, and our whole emotional lives are very different from previous generations. Now, as I would see it, this is a source of many of our problems. It's very difficult to have to actively forge an identity, to ask yourself, who am I? How should I live? How should I dress? How should I be? These are much more open questions than they've ever been for any previous generation. And there are lots of anxieties they provoke.
Therapies of one sort or another are booming, all offering solutions to our insecurities.
Well, in my mind, the main downside would be the fact that we have so many options these days, and we are not pushed into things. We don't have that extra motivation that came from the fact that your parents would pressurize you in something, society would pressurize you in something. It's completely up to you. So you have to find that inner motivation within yourself.
The postmodern condition is characterised by greater personal choice, individualism, and insecurity. But what's happening to bring about these changes when people feel increasingly free to turn their backs on social conventions and make up their own rules? And where does all this leave sociology?
So I told you wrongly and you didn't tell me. So I hope you didn't follow this one. Just now it was this one, right? Oh, so sorry. So those of you who didn't get it, because I confused you. Is it? Okay, now you're going to watch this. Now, media and gender. Okay, so listen carefully.
Sociologists are interested in the relationship between the individual and society.
Pick up any sociology textbook and you'll see the familiar chapter headings of class and ethnicity and gender and so forth. Sociologists argue that these divisions are very important in shaping how people think about themselves and the world. But for the postmodernist, they're just not that important anymore.
Postmodernity refers to the breakdown and fragmentation of the established institutions of modernity. For example, take the economy, work, from being kind of regular factory-based work is changing into much more flexible types of working, part-time, temporary, for example.
Postmodernist theorists do argue that modern society has given way to a postmodern form of society which is much more fragmented, where traditional structures have broken down. And this has important implications for sociology. The traditional divisions within society, class, ethnicity, gender, and so on, were the things that sociologists studied. These were the bread and butter of the work of the sociologists. If these divisions are no longer important, then clearly sociology is no longer relevant in trying to explain them.
So if what sociologists call society or social structure is fragmenting, then how do people develop a sense of who they are and how they fit into the world around them?
Well, for postmodernists, an important part of the answer lies here, with the mass media.
This place a great deal of emphasis on the media because in a world which is dominated by consumption, the media is the source of most of our images about the world. Most of us are bombarded almost from the moment we wake up in the morning until the moment we go to bed by a huge range of images that portray competing and often very different views of the world in which we live.
Media images are copies of reality, but postmodernists argue these images are becoming more important than the originals.
In his famous book, The Image, the American historian Daniel Boorstin illustrates this with a cartoon.
That's a lovely baby you have. Oh, that's nothing. You should see his pictures.
In the contemporary world, media images of one sort or another have become an increasing part of our day-to-day lives. It was believed that the media were rather like a mirror, reflecting or distorting reality. But postmodernists argue the opposite. It's the media that creates our reality.
When postmodernists talk about the media creating reality, they're moving away from the idea that the media represent a reality that exists outside of the media, to saying that actually those two things are indistinguishable. What we have is a media which is constantly creating our reality. So how can we distinguish that from the reality we think we exist in outside of it? So for example, as a woman, if I'm defining my femininity constantly, how do I know that that femininity is only defined by me and isn't defined by all the images of gender that are constantly fed to me through the media? The two things overlap. The media reality is actually inescapable and is a reality.
For postmodernists, the contemporary world is an electronic reality, where global communications disrupt traditional notions of time and space and blur the boundaries of image and reality. We may feel we know the characters in soaps, while our neighbours remain strangers to us. Jean Baudrillard, one of the leading postmodern theorists, argues that we're now living in a new condition of hyperreality.
This really relates to the idea that the world of the media is in some way more real than the reality that it attempts to represent. The distinction between reality and fantasy, or reality and fiction, has become blurred to such a point that it's almost no longer meaningful to make a distinction between the two.
When Baudrillard talks about the media, he's talking about people existing in a world in which they're constantly floating around in a sea of images and a sea of media texts which become their reality. So he's saying we have to get away from the idea that beyond the media representation, there exists some kind of truth. Actually, the truth is the media representation.
For postmodernists, things like theme parks, Disneyland, virtual reality games are merely exaggerated forms of a postmodern world, where copies are seen as more real than the originals. For many sociologists, the media reinforce existing social divisions. The most powerful groups control the media, which then create a mass culture of conformity by socialising people into their values.
The postmodern view of the media takes a very different angle, and it actually starts from the premise that mass production is finished, and what we have now is something which is moving to diversity and fragmentation. And this is really well exemplified in the move to digital broadcasting, where we have a multitude of channels portraying a multitude of messages. So the idea is all these messages can be singled out for particular individual audiences, and that creates diversity, it creates differentiation, and that's where postmodern views of the media begin from.
Media saturation has transformed society into something resembling an endless shopping mall, where we're constantly bombarded with choices about what we should wear, what we should drink, where we should live, and how we should be.
There's an idea within postmodernism that that's a sort of compulsive choice that you engage in. Because of the huge mixture of information that's around and available to us, we're incited to choose incessantly. So we're constantly taking bits and pieces and making up our identity in the way that we want.
Shopping is no longer a chore, but a way of life. But it's not just material goods we consume, it's images, which have meanings and say something about us. We pick and mix from what's on offer.
So we're constantly taking bits and pieces and making up our identity in the way that we want. So the idea is that we sort of lifestyleize constantly. We're picking bits and pieces from all over the place, from wherever we choose to constantly make up our own identity and decide who we are.
For postmodernists, our sense of who we are comes less from things like what we produce and where we live, and more from the images we consume.
In the modern era, the institutions of society such as social class, the family, the education system were seen as very important determinants of people's lives and people's identities. It's often argued that in the postmodern era these things are much less important. We select our identities from a huge range of different sources, from different places, from different influences, many of them coming through the media, and that any one of these traditional institutions in society no longer has the importance that it once had.
Postmodernists argue that as people's identities are no longer anchored in concrete social structures, but rather constructed on the shopping mall of life, then new ideas are needed. The old ones just won't work anymore. So where does this leave our example of gender?
I suppose in the 60s we were more conventional, we were more aware of there were rules in society and girls felt that they had to be feminine and that men had the sort of stiff upper lip and, there wasn't the sort of feeling that you were comfortable wearing trousers and that so much unisex sort of dressing. It was much more sort of falling into your own role, and women still stayed home and were much more conventional.
Women and girls were expected to do the housework. My brother was away at boarding school, but he was never asked to do anything. We were always expected to do it. And when I grew up and got married, I did all the housework. And that's how it was. And we took it for granted.
I can remember my mother asking me to do things for my brother, so we were encouraged to wait on men.
Even in the 60s, there were still fairly clear and consistent differences in the social roles of men and women. Men were men, and women were women.
Gender was very constraining in the sense that women were told what to do and when to do it. And when a female child was born, it was possible to predict her life events fairly consistently.
Yes, I think expectations for boys and girls were different, that the career and a job for a boy was obviously very important and perhaps not so much for a girl.
Well, I can remember wanting to go to college and my mother said, what's the point? You'll get married by the time you're 18 or 20 and you won't be working after that. So there's
But what strikes me about the gender differentiation is the career paths and opportunities that were available to girls. Because when I went to college, the admittance per annum was about 80 new students a year, and the college law was that only 6 of those should be women.
For most people, these gender differences were natural or biological, but sociologists offered a different explanation.
When we talk about gender visions being socially produced, we're trying to get away from the idea that we're born into a particular male or female identity. In other words, that I am naturally female or naturally feminine. It's in my biology, it's in my genes. That's when we're talking about social construction, we're saying that that's wrong. Actually, the way I develop my femininity or the way someone develops their masculinity is the way that society feeds ideas of masculinity and femininity to us. So we grow into being masculine or feminine through the way we're structured socially.
It doesn't seem the same today.
In the 60s, when you were born, you grew up and you was nurtured to become a housewife, to become a mother. Whereas now, when we grow up, it's the same as being a bloke or being a girl. You haven't got that decision made for you already, so you can then choose whether to become a career woman, to become a family, to do both, or whatever. That's your choice.
But I mean, yeah, I don't even know if it's going to come down to that anyway, because everyone's sort of working part-time these days. I think you can mix and match. So you could have like half the week the mother looks after the kids, half the week the father looks after the kids.
Does it have to be more sort of, oh, I'm not going to sew the button on your trousers kind of thing? You can do it yourself.
Changing gender roles don't create any problems for sociology. A lot of work's been done on them. However, the postmodernist argument is not that men and women are changing, but rather that men and women are disappearing as distinct social entities.
The postmodern view of gender differences is really based around that idea of difference. And what happened in a very modernist understanding of gender is that we got the two categories, male on the one hand and female on the other hand, and there was very little room for manoeuvre within those categories. A postmodern view says, because we have so much choice, because we have a multitude of images around us, of which we can pick and choose, and therefore make up an enormous array of possibilities of what gender could be, that dichotomous category of women on the one hand and men on the other ceases to exist. In fact, what we get is a multitude of masculinities and a multitude of femininities. And in fact, the blurring of those two categories can begin to take place.
Women feel free to do things once considered exclusively male, and vice versa.
I don't feel that I have to be a big man anymore. I mean, it's not really like that, I don't think. It's just, I'm just free to be who I want to be, really.
The notion of masculinity has been thoroughly deconstructed. Men can look at their lives and choose to lead their lives however they wish. They can choose to have partners, they can choose not to have partners, they can make choices about their sexual orientation, they can choose about the work that they do, the styles of clothing that they wear. There is infinite choice.
Men also feel the need to sort of join in with emotional conversations and things like that, so they're not just considered to be a bloke, you know, but they've got to seem slightly girly themselves and join in with these conversations about their relationships. And
Would you go up to a bloke at the club and ask him to dance? Totally. I mean, my mum was shocked when she heard this. She's like, oh, I'd be too shy. I'm like, no, of course you do. I mean, a lot nowadays, it's not exactly go-go. Will you dance with me? It's kind of, you just dance. You dance.
So it can actually be quite a radical idea. We get away from that understanding that there can only ever be masculinity and femininity. And actually, we can begin to understand what it might be like if we are not defined purely by our sex as male or female.
So if gender is becoming less a predictor of how people act and think, then it follows that the concept is telling us less and less about how people behave, and theories based on it are becoming increasingly dated.
The notion of gender is redundant in terms of social analysis. We don't need it, and we haven't needed it for some time. We have individual people making a life for themselves, drawing upon resources and making things happen, and they do that irrespective of whether they are classed as male or female. The notion of male and female are classifications which we no longer need.
Certainly when you read the gender chapters in even the most basic sociology textbook, you find yourself wondering if they're writing about the 1990s or the 1960s. Postmodernists make the same point about the other key sociological concepts, such as class, family, ethnicity. They're ideas we no longer need. They're past their sell-by date. So for postmodernists, the social order that characterised modern societies has fragmented. But where does this leave sociology's quest for some true understanding of societies?
The truth, and in its more radical versions, argues that we shouldn't have a notion of truth at all. That all we can do is have conversations about the world, that science is a kind of conversation about the world.
For postmodernists, the boundaries between different forms of knowledge have also fragmented, throwing doubt on sociology's claim to provide some special knowledge of societies. Postmodernists argue that we now live in a world where there are only images, a permanent state of virtual reality. What you think you see is all you get. There are no longer any certainties, no anchor points for saying one theory is truer than another, one way of living better than another. There are no right or wrong answers, only alternatives. Sociological theories like Marxism, functionalism and feminism are just big stories or grand narratives that make unjustified claims to special privileged status.
Traditionally, the goal of sociology was to produce what we might call grand theories, large theories, explanations of a whole range of social phenomena. Postmodernists reject this idea. They reject the possibility of large, all-encompassing theories or explanations, and in their place they would perhaps accept the possibility of lots of small theories which compete with each other. But none of these small theories has any privileged right to claim absolute authority in relation to the others. They're all just another way of looking at the world.
Postmodernism tends to say, well, we live in a fragmented world. If we are dubious about the idea of attaining final truth anyway, all we can probably do is illuminate little nooks and crannies of the world, not understand the world as a whole.
So postmodernists are sceptical of the Enlightenment idea and its development in sociology. It's not that you can't do research, but you have to recognise that at most you're only illuminating a tiny corner of an increasingly fluid and fragmented social world. It would be ironic if in the midst of our brightly lit, high-tech society, the postmodernists had returned us to a new dark ages.
I think the postmodern agenda could very reasonably be seen as one where we are returning to a kind of dark age in which knowledge, wisdom, rationality are no longer seen as important, and in which any view of the world is given equal prominence.
I see postmodernism very much as a return to the Dark Ages. Of course, that's not how they see themselves. They see it as a celebration of aesthetics, of art, of the fiesta, of making your life a work of art, a piece of poetry, etc. But when you give up hope of any kind of systematic analysis, then what are you giving up hope on? You're giving up hope on being able to understand poverty, oppression, discrimination.
But should sociologists be telling people what's right and wrong with society? In the name of progress, sociologists have traditionally been critical of societies and suggested ways of changing them. But to postmodernists, this is an arrogance.
In this period of history, it is a very uncertain place. So individual people are free from what postmodernists refer to as grand narratives. These are big ideas, or as Lyotard calls them, fables. These are ideas like socialism, or like feminism, or like the ideas contained within organised religions that tell people how to lead their lives, what to think, and when to think it, and how to think it. Appropriate ways of behaving.
Postmodern theory is about trying to understand what they think is going on, and therefore it's very different from classical theory because it doesn't believe in the notion of progress in the way the classical theorists did. In fact, because of its scepticism, it feels it can't talk about something called progress.
We're told the postmodern age is one of choice, where we're increasingly free to make our own lives as we wish. But it seems some people have got more choice than others. And they've got this choice because they've got more economic resources. And for want of a better word, we could call these divisions social classes.
And those who seem to end up doing most of the childcare and household chores look suspiciously like what we used to call women before they were deconstructed. So maybe the rejection of sociology's key ideas is a bit premature. There's also contradiction in the postmodern position. They reject general theories or grand narratives and then tell us that the whole of Western society is changing.
However, this doesn't mean that postmodern theory should be dismissed. It's told us a lot about culture and identity in contemporary societies, how the way in which people think about themselves and the world is changing.
Postmodernism has been useful. It's been a very useful analytical tool for sociologists because it's allowed us to understand how the world has become dominated by a mass-mediated environment to a certain extent, and how we actually can construct our own identities through that.
I think the real value of postmodernism is that it's caused people to really look very hard at some of the most established ideas in social science and in society in general, and to look again at some of the entrenched assumptions that we have about the nature of the world we live in.
To read even the most contemporary sociology textbook is a bit like being transported back to the past, to a world of rigid social divisions. We just have to look round us to see that the world's not like that anymore. And perhaps the most important lesson of postmodernity is to remind us that we live in a changing world and that sociology must reflect those changes.